我们继续跟美国企业研究院的亚洲研究主任卜大年先生来讨论这个地区的相关问题。Mr. Blumenthal, I want to ask you about the U.S. and China relations.
Yes.
How do you see the relations is going to evolve in the future, especially there are several official reports coming out by the United States, naming that China could be a strategic competitor in the future. How do you see that?
Well, in fact, the national security strategy of 2017 called China a strategic competitor now, and the national defense strategy did so as well. So the United States policy is to approach China as a strategic competitor that looks to undermine United States worldwide influence, in particular influence here in Asia. So that's the policy. The policy is treat China as a strategic competitor.
But some people, as you know, that a lot of people is saying that maybe it's too early to treat China as a competitor or enemy. That would it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that once you treat them as an enemy, it would turn out that it is going to be an enemy. And how is there still time to avoid that kind of danger that is being posed, or is it already that the relationship have passed that stage?
Well, I'd say it's probably we're a little late in calling China a strategic competitor. Many people in the United States have seen exactly what China was up to for the last 20 years,
right,
and knew that it would be a strategic competitor. I say on the self-fulfilling prophecy argument, the truth of the matter is that the United States treated China as a friend for many, many years, but it still acted as a strategic competitor to the United States. So I don't think the self-fulfilling prophecy argument holds any water. I think everyone has to understand that strategic competition and strategic rivalry do not mean war, they do not mean conflict. There's room for cooperation. It just means that the two countries are competing over who's going to have the most power and who's going to have the most influence, and and what kind of world we're going to live in, a Chinese-led world or a United States-led world. So the stakes are very high, but it still doesn't mean conflict.
What do you mean by there's still room for cooperation while you're saying that is the competition that is being going on? I mean, take the case of South China Sea.
Yes.
Is it going to be something that everyone's afraid that for instance, the U.S. Navy is doing phone up almost monthly, and would that eventually would create tension or even have a military confrontation because of this?
Well, there's nothing inevitable about a military confrontation.
Okay.
So the United States and allies across the world, from the UK and France to Australia and Japan, are taking action to make sure that the Chinese excessive claims in the South China Sea, its militarization, which is a form of forced territorial change, doesn't stand. But that does not mean conflict. That means that the United States is going to stake out a position that does not accept South China Sea claims by China. The hope is that after some time, China sees that it's futile to continue with this advance, and the two sides can talk about peaceful resolution.
That means that even though the U.S. is conducting its military exercise with ASEAN countries in the South China Sea area, you don't think that will create tension with China?
Well, of course there's tension, of course. I mean, there's no way around tension. The United States has its national security interests, and China has very different national security interests. It's about managing the tension. The United States was in a Cold War. The reason they called it a Cold War is because the Soviets and the United States never fought, right? They talked and they cooperated, and they wanted to stay out of war.
Right.
So it's not a Cold War. Right now it's very different. But the United States and China talk all the time, and they talk about all kinds of issues. But neither side wants a war, and so they're working hard to avoid one.
Regarding the Taiwan Strait, we in Taiwan also noticed that U.S. have been sending its naval ships regularly now going through the Taiwan Straits and announcing it. I mean, before maybe it's we never heard about it, and maybe they are doing this passing, but they are not announcing it in public. What's the purpose of the ships sailing through the Taiwan Strait? Is it the same as the follow-up that the U.S. have been doing in the South China Sea?
Well, it's very similar. So
okay.
it's a reaction to Chinese excessive claims. So the world order has freedom of navigation in international straits.
Right.
But the Chinese claim that the Taiwan Straits are not international straits. But anyone has the right to transit the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese, what we don't want to happen is the Chinese creating a de facto sphere of influence that says to other countries, you need our permission to transit international straits. So the United States is going to continue to exercise in all straits and all waterways that it's legally allowed to do, and the Taiwan Strait is one of them.
Let me try to throw at you some of the questions that we heard from some of the Asian neighbors that we are having.
Yes.
That the major concern they are having is whether the U.S. had its commitment in Asia, that the credibility of the U.S. Keep on to stay in Asian Pacific. One of the examples people are raising these days is the U.S. pulling out its troops from northern Syria and let down or even so-called abandoning the Kurds allies that they are having over there. Would that happen in Asia, for instance, doing that to Afghanistan? For instance, the U.S. having talked with Taliban these days. Would it abandon the Taliban government in that case? Or is it that Taiwan is one of the ally that the U.S. maybe would not show its commitment in this part of the world? What's your response to that kind of suspicions or that kind of the wording?
Well, let's look at the actions of the United States in the Asia Pacific. We're in a situation where, as you said, the United States and Taiwan have settled on the largest arms package since 1992, as you said. The United States and Taiwan are in constant communication about every issue, from cyber to political influence to the possibility of a free trade agreement. The relationship is robust. It speaks for itself. As you said before, the United States has started in the last few years again to do FONOPs inside the Taiwan Strait. So cooperation could always improve, but is pretty good.
Right.
Then if you look at the United States and its activities in the last few years, the ramping up of activities in the South China Sea, that's a pretty strong sign of commitment. If you look at the United States and the building of the relationships with new partners like Vietnam and the Philippines and India and Indonesia, again, actions speak for themselves in that regard. The U.S. and Japan have a very strong alliance and very strong relationship, are cooperating over the last 9, 8, 10 years in ways we never could have imagined, from missile defense to other types of capabilities. So again, actions speak much louder than words, and the United States is showing every reason for countries to be reassured that it's very committed to the region, and it takes the region and China's activities in the region as its number one national security priority.
Having said that, but there's still there's a worry that since there's two big powers now in Asia, China and the United States, the Asian countries sometimes are afraid that they will have to force to choose sides.
Yes.
And this turn of choosing sides is something that is very worrying for a lot of them. For instance, South Korea, they claim they have been suffered dearly because of U.S. deploy THAAD, the missile defense system on South Korea, that had suffered from the China is not sending its tourist group over there. They are blocking their trade, so on and so forth. So, is that the price that the Asian country is going to pay? I mean, you will have to make a decision on taking sides, on which side you're going to be.
Well, the only country that will force Asians to take sides is China, and they're already doing so. And they're acting in very bullying ways, and they force the South Koreans. But ultimately, the South Koreans have always decided on the alliance with the United States.
Right.
So it's not the United States coming into Asia and saying, please choose sides. It's the United States responding to Asian demands that it stay here and have a robust presence here and become and remain the security partner of first resort, as well as, by the way, by far the biggest economic market in the world.
Right.
So they may have to choose sides, but that's because the Chinese are always bullying them to choose sides. But it's not the United States that's doing that.
It's interesting that you mentioned, because a lot of Asian countries are thinking, on the one hand, we have to have the Chinese market. The other hand will be the U.S. security that is we are counting on. But there's something that can combine those together is the TPP that have been negotiated for such a long time. But in the last hour that President Trump decided to walk out from the TPP.
Well, that's not exactly correct.
Right, okay.
The TPP faced opposition. It was done in the last minute during an election year.
During the election, right.
President Obama's own party was the most vociferously against it. The Speaker of the House right now, Nancy Pelosi, gave a big speech against it. Secretary Hillary Clinton, who had been for it, came out against it. Every leading presidential candidate was against the TPP. President Trump just was the one who sealed the deal. Trade politics in the United States is very difficult right now. But I will remind you that that it's still the United States that is by far the largest market in the world. So most Asian countries, while there's trade with China on certain issues, at the end of the day, it's the U.S. consumer that they want. And when you talk to the Vietnamese and you say, what do you want? They say access to the U.S. market. So the United States politically, internally, is going to have to figure out its approach to trade. But it's simply not true that the United States is a security partner and China is the market. The United States is both the market and the security partner.
Lastly, I want to ask you about the U.S. have withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF. And now there's talks about that the U.S. tried to deploy some of the conventional new missiles along posing along the Asian countries that can pose a threat to China. Australia, Japan, and South Korea, they are all, have they been asked whether they can deploy the American missiles on their land, or they haven't began to proceed? Would that be a focus of conflict in the future for China and the United States?
Well, it's very premature.
Right.
So the United States did the right thing that a lot of us have been calling for years, which is get out of this treaty that's only hampering the United States. It's not hampering Russia that was cheating on it. Chinese obviously have benefited from this treaty. So the United States will have a lot more options to deploy conventional firepower that's survivable in the Asia-Pacific region. But it's far premature to start talking to other partners and Asian nations about deployment of those systems. I will say that when you come back to your earlier questions about Taiwan's future in military affairs, Taiwan's own development of its own mobile missiles, which it has, is going to be very, very key to Taiwan's defense. But that's its own doing, its own deployments, its own missiles, its own mobile sites, and so forth. And you know that's positive for Taiwan's deterrence.
Finally, I want to get your comment on, you have been visiting Taiwan for so many times now. What's your impression over the years on Taiwan? It had changed a lot, both politically and even on the street, people are changing a lot. What's your general impression on Taiwan over the years?
Well, I've always been very optimistic about Taiwan, and I know it lives in a tough neighborhood, but it's always remarkable to see its resiliency, despite the fact that it's under threat and threats of isolation by China. But leading economy in the semiconductor and IT fields, and it continues to be so. Tremendous resiliency and enterprising nature and friendly, gracious nature of the Taiwanese people. It's really a very remarkable place that Taiwanese should be very proud of, and continuing to expand its liberal democratic values as well. And so the United States will always stand by Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bruno.
My pleasure.
For taking the interview.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sure.
谢谢各位的收看，我们下次见。